Ladies and gentlemen, friends, welcome to the National Museum of the United States Navy. My name is Mark Weber. I'm the managing director here, and we're thrilled to have you all here as we remember the events of December 7th, 1941. Before proceeding any further, I would like to thank our special guest for today, Rear Admiral Ted Walker, and also Mr. Pete Kelsey, for providing what I think will be a fantastic program this morning. First of all, I would like to ask you to join me in welcoming the Director of the Naval History and Heritage Command, Rear Admiral Sam Cox, retired. Sir?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I actually thought it'd be better to wear my Arizona shirt instead of a tie today in honor of the occasion. But I thank all of you for coming out today. It's a day that we as a nation never want to forget because there's some incredible lessons that come from this, particularly what happens when a nation is unprepared for war. But 76 years ago, the aircraft from 6 carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy attacked Pearl Harbor. The conventional wisdom today is kind of like the U.S. Navy was laying around the beach drinking Mai Tais and had no clue what was about to happen, when the reality is actually far different. To the extent that people were exhausted on the morning of 7 December or asleep, it was exhaustion from months of intense combat training, getting ready for a war that everyone in a position of responsibility knew was coming. The question was precisely where and when. And the fact that more Japanese aircraft weren't shot down that morning had more to do with the inadequacy of the weapons with which our ships were equipped than with the readiness and the training of the sailors to use them. In fact, the sailors responded quickly with incredible valor and bravery. There were 15 medals of honor and over 50 Navy crosses awarded to U.S. sailors for their actions during that battle. And we still learn more all the time. In fact, today out in Iowa, there's an award ceremony for Chaplain Aloysius Schmidt, who was lost on the USS Oklahoma. And his award of a Navy Marine Corps Medal, which is a non-combat award for heroism, is actually being upgraded to a Silver Star. And also at Pearl Harbor itself, the family of Boatswain's Mate Second Class Joseph George will be receiving a Bronze Star with V for Valor for what he did in saving the lives of 6 Arizona sailors when he threw the line from Vestal up to the anti-aircraft platform, and 6 of those men who, surrounded by flames and fire and strafing Japanese and exploding machine guns and whatnot, they made it down this line. 2 of them died of their burns, but 2 of them are still alive today and are among the 5 survivors of the Arizona to this point. So the final story of Pearl Harbor is still, not written. But it's increasingly rare that we have the opportunity to speak with those who were actually there, those who served. But in this case, we have a witness, Rear Admiral Ted Walker, who had a long and distinguished career in the United States Navy, 34 years as a supply corps officer, a winner of the Navy Supply, Lifetime Achievement Award for everything he did on active duty, and continuing to help foster the memory of our brave sailors as in his role with the Navy Memorial Foundation. So it was a distinct pleasure and a great honor for me to invite Rear Admiral Ted Walker to the podium here to share with us what he saw as a child on that day, which is something that probably no one ought to ever be made to see.
You get the picture? Well, Admiral Cox is absolutely right. I am not a Pearl Harbor survivor. I'm a Pearl Harbor witness. I was just about 9 years old, and I was out in the area. My father was a naval officer. My father at the time was the operations officer, submarines United States Fleet. He was the inventor and fielder of the submarine computer, then now known as a TDC, the torpedo data computer. And he had started out as the weapons officer for the submarine force. And I said submarines United States Fleet. One thing you got to understand, the world was organized differently in 1940, 41 than it is that we all remember. There was one United States fleet. It was based on the West Coast and in the Pacific. The ships in the Atlantic were the Atlantic Squadron. And it wasn't until just before the war started that the Atlantic got a fleet designation, and Rear Admiral King was the boss. So, set the stage. One of the things, and as the Admiral pointed out, the troops were trained to a fairly fine edge in terms of reacting when the bombs began to fall and the machine gun fire took over. But the one thing that they weren't prepared for, any of them, from the admirals to the seamen, they didn't have a war mentality. They were technically trained, and they could react. But nobody really in uniform in America had taken on board the aspects that make you ready for war. And if you've ever seen the movie Patton, the opening comment of that movie sets it all, and it shows what they didn't have. And that was, they hadn't been blooded. And until you see a shipmate or a fellow infantryman dead beside you and he's your best buddy and you know he's been killed, or you yourself have been wounded, you don't understand the extra effort and the extra sacrifice you have to make up here to be ready for war. And we were not. We were trained up, we were quote ready, but we really weren't. The guys, our community, as bad as they weren't even ready then. You've all heard the famous story of the radar operators that saw planes coming in and so on. Well, they had a second lieutenant on duty. They were running a first radar station out there. Nobody had ever used it in a combat situation or even trained for it. So I think the fact that our troops reacted as well as the Admiral said, and by just synthesizing, it appears to me the Japanese suffered about 10% losses of aircraft during the raid. That's a pretty high percentage of loss, particularly when you're hitting, quote, an unprepared target. That's, you know, we in Europe, when we started to get 10% losses in the 8th Air Force, we stopped running over targets that we were losing 10% planes because we couldn't sustain the effort to do it. So that's some of the background of what was going on. So we were physically prepared, given the equipment we had, but we were not mentally prepared. We really were not. And the equipment, well, that's another question. Very iffy. And again, in the mental side, you know, we had a very, very different Americans as a nation and as individuals, had a very different and rather scathingly low opinion of Orientals and their capability, and therefore collectively as a nation and individually as officers and men, both in the Navy and the Army, we denigrated and downplayed the ability of these people to fight a war. Yet they had been in war for 6 years in China and had developed the war mentality. Now let's talk about Pearl. This is Pearl here. There's Battleship Row. And I'm up here somewhere. This is Honolulu over here. And I'm up here in a house, in a civilian house. And that morning, I happened to be out in the yard raking leaves with a gentleman named Robert Ueda, who was the husband of our maid, and Robert and Nancy lived in a house, in an apartment in our house. And Robert was an employee of the Army at Hickam Field in the PX. Sunday, he had his day off. So we were raking leaves, and all of a sudden, whoomp, 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 whoomp. And I turned to Robert and I something to the effect, Robert, why is the Army practicing on Sunday? And he said, I don't think it's practice, because practice shells that I've seen burst white. These are bursting black. And about that time, the phone rang in the house, and it was the base telling my father to get up out of the bunk and come to war. And so I was sent across the street to wake up his classmate, Ed Beck, who was the skipper of a destroyer down in the harbor. And so shortly thereafter, 10, 15 minutes later, Lieutenant Commander Walker and Lieutenant Commander Beck drove off to war in my father's 1929 Rio Jalopy. And interestingly, my father got hit with a piece of shrapnel as they went through the gate. It didn't hurt him, and he swears it was a piece of shrapnel from one of our 5-inch bursts that we'd been shooting at the Japanese. Anyway, it bounced off his leg and tore his trousers, but it didn't hurt. So I was up here. Where the hell is that? Yeah, there it is. I was up there, and the first wave at about give or take 8 o'clock came in basically this way. And that's when they did the basic devastation to the ships. And from where I was just about 9 years old, a couple of weeks shy of being 9 years old. And so I climbed the banyan tree next to my house and got up on the roof. Much to the consternation of my mother, I spent the whole day mourning up there. And the reason I did was she couldn't climb the tree to get me down. And so I was able to see the smoke. I was able to see the smoke, and occasionally you feel the concussions. I definitely saw the Arizona blow up in the distance. And the noise was just a continuous low level from my point of view, but continuous roar. Smoke everywhere. And the sky was full of flak. Oh, within about, and in that raid, nothing happened close to me. About 9 o'clock it subsided, and then it came up again. And the second wave, the majority, came over these mountains. That's Kaneohe out over there. Came over there this way. And in that one, I tell myself, oh yeah, you could see the pilots in the planes. I couldn't, I don't think. But I could definitely see the meatballs on an airplane, so they came in that close. They kind of swooped down this valley, down there over. So that, and they came pretty close. And I think it was an accident. I think some either bomber or fighter pilot triggered the bomb release early. Because of, well, it was about 100 pound, maybe at most a 200-pound bomb. Landed in a vacant lot, a block and a half away. So there was more, and of course, the major Japanese mistake now, as we all look at it, see all these? Those are all fuel storage. They didn't hit them. And that was a fair portion of the entire petroleum available to the Pacific Fleet for quite a while, if they'd have done it. Furthermore, the blaze would have flooded into the shipyard area and ruined all kinds of things that would have been months and months to get it cleaned up. The fact that they didn't damage the logistics support base allowed us to react rapidly. And in several months, we were doing things that no one thought we could do. And I'll bring that up as we get to Midway in a minute. But it was all over by about 10 o'clock. And, then people say, well, what did you think? What were you thinking? I don't know. Every time somebody asked me that, I said, I don't know what I was thinking. It was interesting. I was 9 years old. And this is, again, it's hard for you people all out there to understand what a very calm, peaceful world I grew up in. Now, I'm a child of the Depression. And the Hollywood movies, remember, in those days, were not exciting. And if you watch the TCM channel, some of those old great 1930s movies, they're mostly chatty movies. There's a lot of dialogue, and you have to listen to the thing and catch the nuances and so on. But it's very calm. Even if you went to see Hopalong Cassidy or whoever it was, when they shot him, the guys fell over dead. Blood. They just died. And none of the gore and clash and roar. And so you folks have grown up with television and so on, and news. Gosh, you get news to you, just don't even want to listen to it. In my day, we went to the movies to see our serials, Sky King or something like that. And if we got there early, we had to sit through Warner Pathé News for 20 minutes and watch the Brits being bombed. But even that was cleaned up. And so war was something that very remote. Our war, literally, in these days, I was still listening to the radio on a crystal set that I built myself. Remember, all of the ships in the Navy didn't have radios until the 30s. In 1940, we put the first radar to sea. The first use of the radar really in any context, and we didn't know how to use it, was in Guadalcanal in the fall of '42. And that was one of the reasons we had so much trouble. We were trying to assimilate a new weapons capability, if you will, and we didn't have any tactics or doctrine to use it. So it was a very, very different world. We used to hear the hit parade. You all don't know it. It was the top 10, but the radios had to be very powerful to listen to stateside. And it turned out the car radios were more powerful than the ones in the houses. And so we go to sit in Punsey Bridges' father's convertible, 1938 Ford, and listen to the hit parade, and that was it. So what happened? Well, when the Japanese went away, then it really hit the fan. It was instant blackout. Remember, there was no air conditioning out there, so you had a choice. You could sit in the darkness with no lights at all, and that means you didn't smoke a cigarette. I didn't smoke, but my mother did. But you couldn't even, if an area warden came by and saw the glow of an end of the cigarette in your house, you got a bad one. You just had to be black. But you did have open windows and you had a breeze. Or you covered your windows totally with thick black cloth and roasted. So I spent the next 6 months of my life in the darkness, playing games of what I'm thinking about. You think about things around the house and somebody had to figure out what to just to stay busy. We didn't go back to school until the end of January, first week in February. I was going to Punahou School, which was downtown, down in that area. And the Army moved in, knocked the tops off of buildings and put anti-aircraft guns in it, including the library. So we were moved to a new building for then building University of Hawaii up further up the side of the mountain. And it was a real shock. We were bussed in, and in the yard, right outside, were slick trenches and Z's. And from then on until school was over at the end of April, at an unannounced time, at least 3 days a week, there was a siren, and we had X number of minutes on, I forgot how much it was, not very many, to get out of our rooms and into the slick trenches, and we were timed. Right after the first of the year, we got out, by the way, I was now at 9 years old, the man of the house, because my father was never there. So I got the instruction along with my mother. Attitudes toward females were much different in those days. Since I was the man of the house. I went to the instructions along with her. On gas attacks, I got my gas mask, as did everybody. Mine came just about on my birthday in January. And you could not be seen without it. You could not be out of your house anywhere for any reason that you didn't have your gas mask around your shoulders strapped on. I went to school to learn how to handle thermite incendiary bombs. And thermite bombs, about that big around. And so we were issued a long-handled shovel. And you had to have all around your house 2 or 3 buckets of sand. So when the thermite bomb came through the roof, as it obviously was going to, and hit, you were supposed to go get a bucket of sand, throw the bucket of sand on the deck, and then put the thermite bomb, spewing fire and sparks, on the sand, and the thermite bomb was hot enough to turn the sand to glass. But it didn't burn down your house. This was the theory. This was the theory. Fortunately, I only had to do with a play bomb and had a little bit of spark in it. But I don't think we were going to beat the system. But it made us all feel like we were ahead of the power curve a little bit. And of course, we were rationed. Everything was rationed. We had a lot of tropical fruit and that kind of stuff, but stuff from the mainland was almost impossible to get. One of the major impacts was many of the small businessmen went out of business. A good friend of my father's and mother's had owned a paint store, Sherman-Williams Paint Store in Honolulu. Well, he was out of business. And so what he did to just keep his family together for the rest of the war was he was the night manager at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel. I mean, and people just had to do whatever they could to make do with what they had. We were allowed to stay, that is my mother and my sister and myself. We were allowed to stay and not evacuate. Most of the families were evacuated rather soon. But my mother was rather integral to the Navy Relief Society in the area, and she was in the business of helping the wives and children, particularly of the wounded and the dead, put their lives together and get out of there. So she and we were allowed to stay. My father was on active part of the staff until after the Battle of Midway, which is early part of June, at which time he was told he was too old to get another submarine command. He'd already had 2. And since he hadn't been to war in a submarine, he couldn't be a division commander and be a Wolfpack commander. So he said, fine, I'll go to destroyers. And so we got surfaced and we sailed out of this channel in the last week in June with a partially repaired battleship Pennsylvania, 4 fighter destroyers, an Army transport, a Navy transport, and we were on a commandeered banana boat, the SS Antigua, which was pretty nice for us because it wasn't militarized. So we had my father loved it. There was a bar. And we came home. It took us about 8 days to get home because the old girl in Pennsylvania couldn't go very fast. She was just barely put together enough so that she could make the West Coast and go into the shipyard. Now, before that happened, in late March, in the middle of the night, it was the only time in the whole situation I was scared. In the middle of the night, there were 2 huge explosions right up about in here, which isn't too far from where I was. And the Japanese had launched a couple of airplanes from submarines. Now, this is Pearl. Up here somewhere is Midway, and between Pearl and Midway is a bunch of little places, Johnson Island and French frigate shoals. And so it became obvious when the sun came up, and by the way, it was a Keystone Cops that night. First, all the searchlights went on and they were firing. Then they turned everything off and there was nothing. They didn't even come close to hitting the Japanese airplanes. But those bombs landed about 3 blocks from me on the side of the mountain, and that was the total damage the Japanese did. But, and this is a good lesson in war and everything else. What goes around comes around. We were smart enough to realize we already knew the Japanese were the only people in the world that had that big submarines. They built 4 of them. They could handle 2 float planes in a hangar with their wings folded, and they'd bring them out and launch them. Okay. They had to be launched from somewhere and in calm water. So the conclusion was, rightly, French frigate shoals, Johnson Island, that area. Immediately, they sent patrol ships, a mine ship and a patrol ship, to be permanently stationed up there. Fast forward, last week in May, first week in June. Yamamoto and his guys are coming in to attack Midway. The search pattern includes airplanes from 2 submarines stationed in French frigate shoals searching the Ark, where our ships, quote, were going to come out and go through that Ark and give them. The Japanese ships showed up, and there were our patrol ships, and they turned around and went home. Instantly, Yamamoto was denied the intelligence capability in that whole southern arc below Midway. Guess what? That's where we went through to sneak in on them. And if Midway's here, Yamamoto coming in that way, we were up here coming in, hiding. But we went through the arc like that. So he had other intelligence failures, but that was one of the critical ones. And if he hadn't, or somebody in the Japanese hierarchy, hadn't thought about bombing us again, they would have been there. Now, whether they would have succeeded in catching us, or whether we would have gotten through before they actually set up the line, that's a question. I don't think even history can answer that. But the fact of the matter is they, because of their mistakes, come back to haunt you. And you never know when you're making a mistake until the haunting comes along. But that came back to haunt them. And so that was the end of that. And that's my story of Pearl Harbor. It was a very interesting time. My father went on to have a marvelous career in destroyers in the Atlantic, and he had a very famous guy as his exec. A young man, or a lieutenant, by the name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr., the president's son. And Frank and my father had one hell of a great war for about 2 years. They were in Casablanca, Morocco, in the invasion of Sicily. They went to Murmansk and had a couple of runs to England. And they really had a great time. But they were at Casablanca with the president. So I will take questions if there are any. Anybody got a question? Yes, sir.
In the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, there was
the rumor mill was rampant about what the Japanese were going to do next. Did you experience any?
Yes, I didn't, because I didn't know the location. But yesterday, the day before yesterday, I gave the same talk to a church group of mine, and I brought some of my propaganda. One of them is I have the actual front page of the Honolulu newspaper on the Monday afterwards. And as I pointed out to them, there is only one bit of information on that front page that's true. And that was Australia and Great Britain declare war on Japan. The other one said saboteurs have been landing somewhere. The other one said Japanese have landed somewhere else. And the whole front page was nothing but a rumor, except the fact that the Brits and the Aussies had declared war on the Japanese. And we had that all the time. We were always semi-prepared for paratroopers. This is something that we all, you never know when we're going to have to live through this again, whether we want to or not. And the fact of the matter is you got to stand off and take this thing in context. You know, all panic on the West Coast, on the East Coast. And when you look at it, it was never in the cards. It was never at all. One of the reasons the Japanese surprised us at Pearl, we were pretty convinced that they were going to hit the Philippines and go down through there, because we know what they were after. They were after the food production of Indochina, which is one of the reasons we were in Vietnam, by the way. During the Vietnam era, when that started, 60% of the rice eaten by the Japanese came from Vietnam. So anyway, in 1940-41, 90-some-odd% of the oil and the rubber and some of the other critical items for Japan's economy and their war machine came right out of there, right up between the Philippines and Vietnam, South China Sea. And so we were absolutely convinced that the Philippines had to go, whether they went right away, but they were going to go. The Japanese were going to go. And we also knew we couldn't defend them. But we just couldn't. It was too far. It was too far a reach for us in those days. So, now, why was oil so important? Almost instantly. The reason was, most of you don't realize, you've grown up with Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf and all that jazz. As far as we were concerned, Saudi Arabia didn't even exist when I was a kid. The United States was the #1 oil-producing country in the world when the war started. As a move to try to get the Japanese to back off their war, to back off China, Mr. Roosevelt, in early 1941, stopped our oil from going to Japan. Now, you had to go to Bali and Sumatra in that place. Secondly, your used 1929 Rio was crushed up and sent to Japan, along with your old pots and pans and everything else. We provided, through our scrap metal, over 90% of the metal processed in Japan to build ships and guns and take care of their economy. He also stopped that. That forced the Japanese, since they were not going to change their desire for domination of Asia. And their government really was not in a position to, because their government was in the hands of radical military. All during the 30s, there had been assassination attempts, even one probably on Hirohito himself. There are 5 or 6 senior diplomats and senior government officials who were actually murdered by young Army officers. They were otherwise intimidated. And so they were on an unchangeable course. And by early summer, they had come to the conclusion that if they wanted to continue to exist as a nation of any consequence, they had a 3-year window to attack the United States. Now, if you're studying history, we've been in competition with the Japanese as an enemy back to the days of Teddy Roosevelt. Think about it. We, the United States Navy, wrote a plan called Plan Arnage, which we didn't deviate from much in the Second World War, but it was written in the teens and just modified as the situation in the world ebbed and flowed. But we had been programming the Japanese as a constant enemy in the Pacific since 1900. Think about that. So it all came to fruition in the 40s. We pushed them, and they would not change. So war was inevitable. And they felt, Admiral Yamamoto sold the deal on Pearl Harbor, that if they could do what they did to us, God was on the side of the righteous and our aircraft carriers were somewhere else without the Halsey. If they could get us and put us in a hole, that if they had 6 to 10 months to run wild in the Pacific, which they didn't listen to Yamamoto, who told them, you know, you're going to wake a sleeping giant. When they start turning the wheels on that government and on that war production, stand by, we're going to drown them. And that's exactly what happened. But it took until 1943. We fought a holding action, all of 42 and most of 43. The greatest single thing that your Congress ever did vis-a-vis the Second World War happened before we were at war. It was in the summer of 1940. And in a 6-week period, the Congress of the United States authorized and funded just shy of a 300-ship Navy, larger than the United States Navy today entirely. And they did it in 6 weeks, and it was when these ships, on the war-based production schedules, 24 hours a day, when these ships started to arrive in early 43, is when the tide changed. And we began to roll. That's when the Essex class carriers showed up. That's when our battleships, there's an Iowa sailor right here, I'm a Jersey sailor. And that's when all of these things, that's when the vast numbers of destroyers and new submarines came in, the Blau class, and some of those. And new airplanes, where's that? Like that bent-wing eliminator down there. You know, it was really something, and as predicted. But we had to hold the line, and it was a little side. The United States has never lost a modern attack carrier in combat. Think about that. A modern carrier has never been sunk in combat. Every one of the carriers that we lost, the big ones, in the Second World War were designed before 1934, built before 1939, and they were the only ones that were sunk. We had one damaged, but nobody sunk. We were talking today, earlier on, if we had battleships today, where some of us think we should, would they be vulnerable? And the answer is, you can sink any ship, but not as vulnerable as people like to make it look. And useful, yes. So anyway, hey, if there are no questions, I'll turn it over to Admiral Cox. I've occupied too much time, but I could talk forever if you give me a chance. Yes, sir.
Sir, did you know any Japanese civilians in Honolulu or as a school child, and what were the relations with them to be able to...
You know, people, that's a good question. People ask me, we'd have none of the, you know, we had a significant Japanese population, and we also had a significant mixed Japanese-Filipino, mixed Japanese-Caucasian, Portuguese. I mean, we had a lot of Japanese and a lot of Filipino people in particular. And we had none of that. You know, there was an original or initial, I think is probably the best word, a couple of weeks, and things settled out. Everybody went around, pulled up their I'll just get up out of the water and get with it. We had none of the panic and foolishness that happened on the West Coast. None. And as I say, we had a live-in maid and her husband. By the way, Robert Midway, that was in the yard with me, went on to join the Army and got 2 Silver Stars and 3 Purple Hearts in Italy. That was the, I think you...
You can go back to the...
Well, I think you all probably remember that Japanese regiment, a very famous regiment, is the most highly decorated unit in the United States Army ever. So Robert, you all probably have heard of Senator Midway from Hawaii, a very famous senator. He was also on that regiment. Okay, now. So, any other questions? Okay, thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Did you know John McCain when you were a kid growing up? I think he was his father.
Oh, no, Johnny's too young. All these guys are too young. He's too young. I never knew him on that. You got to remember.
In Japan.
Thank you, sir. Actually, I did know his father, John. His father was a real character. Smoked big, stinky black cigars, and a small guy. And when I was a student at a war college, actually, the doctor stepped on he came, and he gave a tremendous demonstration of sea power. Sea power isn't just Navy ships. It's everything having to do with the sea. It's fishing boats, it's commercial liners, it's resupply ships, it's everything. It's the ability to use the ocean to your advantage. However you use it, you gotta have the freedom to use it. And of course he knows that. We're in a death fight with the Air Force. The Air Force was trying to put you people probably don't remember, but they tried to put us out of business. One of the great heroes of the United States Navy is Jimmy Osama, the dictator of North Korea, decided to attack South Korea. That's the greatest favor that ever happened to the Navy. The Army was incapable of defending it. The Air Force couldn't get there because they had a airline. And because we had a bunch of cheap carriers and about 6,000 trained up naval aviator reserves, we were able to move in with our battleships and our cheap carriers to provide air cover. We put 7,000 Marines on the beach at Busan to stabilize the perimeter. Those 7,000 Marines had never seen each other. The Marine Corps had shrunk to the point that they had to pick up guard battalions, people scattered, throw them together, and put together a makeshift 7,000-man brigade. Anyway, that's safe because we were on a downward slope. The Secretary of Defense had canceled our new carriers. All of our ships were in one clause, and we were going up with it. And because the Air Force sold people with victory to aircraft, they actually did. Korea proved the difference. Interestingly, it wasn't over, though, even though we stabilized Korea eventually. In 1955-56, the Army made a specific move to do away with the Marine Corps completely, except for 7,000 people as embassy workers. And that was a fight for the lives of the Marine Corps. And fortunately, they had a great time now. And now we work. They saved the Marine Corps. Well, we were in a fight for our lives. We're in a fight for our lives. So anyway, so Jocko, he comes and he's lecturing us, ready to stage like this, and he calls an Army major up out of the thing in an Air Force house. And he's got 2 ribbons. And he's got a silver ribbon and a blue, navy blue. So he asked the Air Force guy to take the ribbon, walk across the stage, and walk down the side aisle until the ribbon stopped. He went about a third of the way up the aisle and stopped. Then he had the Army guy, like, stop walking with the ribbon. He walked around, 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 and knocked up in the shoe. He said, now, ladies and gentlemen, that's sea power. The silver ribbon is all of the cargo that the Air Force supplied to the United States Navy. With every 4 engineer trained in the entire inventory in 1945. In a year. And that's not allowing any turnaround. The red ribbon is what one single World War II convoy would take to England in 16 days. And that doesn't count the extra ships we have to put in the water. 10 tankers twice a month to provide fuel for the Air Force to come home. That was the most dramatic statement of sea power you'll ever get. Think about it, keep it in your hip pocket. If somebody wants to know what is the effect of sea power on the rest of it. Remember, 95% of the cargo by ton that flows to this country from overseas or out of this country overseas goes to ship power. 95% of it here in Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, anywhere. In order to do that, we have to be able to, even if it's only in a local area, we have to be able to control the sea. So, Jocko became a big CMP in the center of the water and showed us the land in Europe. And he showed the ocean. There's a 4-ocean challenge. Sea power control. I'm not quite sure.